This is the Sivga Anser. This is Sivga's latest headphone. It's an open back dynamic driver set. It's coming in at just $200. And it's a bit of a rare breed in that it is an open back headphone with a lot of bass. And if you know anything about open back headphones, they usually do not have a lot of bass. This guy does. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and for the past month or so, I've been living with this headphone, comparing it with some other headphones in at around its price range, and I'm ready to let you know what I think. In fact, just a quick story time before we dive into the details in this one. So I was in Shenzhen, China earlier this year, back in September, and I stopped by, visited the Sivga booth. I listened to a handful. They basically wanted me to hear like their new P2 Pro, which is, it's like a $450 headphone. I think that was the one that's kind of like their flagship for the year. And I didn't really care for it. And then also sitting next to it was the Sennheiser Peacock, which I listened to. It's like a $1,500 headphone. I also really did not care for that one, but this one was sitting in there and it was their cheaper one, so I think the rep there was a little bit hesitant to hand it to me, but he handed me this one, their $200 headphone. I was like, that one's your best headphone. So with that in mind, let's dive to the table. We'll talk about what you get inside the box, physical form factor, build quality, comfort, all that jazz. Then we'll get into talking about the sound signature, what it sounds like in my head, and then again some comparisons with some other similarly priced headphones. Again, $200 open back. There's your frame of reference. Okay, what do you get inside the box is what you see here on the screen. Here's the box, nice packaging, nice and simple. I really like this, even though it kind of looks just a little cardboard boxy. I think that is actually pretty classy, and I don't feel as bad about throwing that away as I do some other boxes, and I throw away a lot of boxes. Anyway, what you get inside of it is fairly minimal, which is probably what you should expect for a headphone at around this price point. You get a carry bag. It's not like a protective carry case, but I guess it's better than nothing to have something to hold your headphones and your spare accessories in. And apart from this bag, you do get a couple of, well, okay, not very many accessories. You get a cable and you get an adapter. So by default, this cable terminates in a standard 3.5 termination, but you do have a 3.5 to 6.3 mil adapter in the box if you want to use this with more traditional desktop or home stereo equipment. But the cable itself is on the shorter side. It's about a standard like 4-foot cable, which for me is perfect. I like to use headphones walking around the house with my portable devices, and for me this length is perfect. But if you are looking for a longer cable, I know a lot of desktop headphones sometimes will come with 5, 6, or even 8-foot cables. I prefer this personally, but if you don't, well, there you go. Apart from that, here's some things to talk about this cable. All right, it terminates in standard dual 3.5 mil connectors, which I really like. This means that it's very easy to find replacement cables if you need to, or, you know, I guess if you wanted to replace it because something went wrong with it, or you just didn't like the way that this cable feels, it's very easy to find replacements. Other than that, what can we talk about? Let's talk about the build quality on this cable. It is, I don't know how much this will come across on camera because it's not super zoomed in, but it is like a cloth covered cable here that is a little bit on the stiff side. I'll be honest, it's I would say a decent cable, but I think the stiffness is probably the biggest issue I have with it. It's not really going to come across here because I think it actually roadie wraps quite well. It's more just in, let's see if I set it like this, you can kind of see that it'll hold its shape a little bit. It's a little bit memory prone, but once you straighten it out, I actually found this to be actually a pretty serviceable little headphone cable. Not something I would be in a rush to go out and replace, but that will lead us into talking about the headphone itself. So wrap this cable up real quick, put it to the side, and let's focus on the build quality of the headphone. So the Sivga Anser. So a couple things are going to stand out to you immediately. And first, to me, it's like for $200, the build quality and the materials in this thing are actually kind of fantastic. I actually haven't opened it up to see if this is real wood, but I believe it is, and I haven't looked again. So maybe I would be mistaken, but if it's a fake wood, it's good enough to fool me looking at it. And yeah, generally I just think it's a nice, handsome aesthetic. All the rest of the materials are quite premium as well. That's why I don't really suspect them of any trickery here, right? Like this grill out here, this is metal. Even the yokes up here are metal. The headband here is metal. This bit is metal. You've got a nice softly padded headband here. You can see that it's got kind of like a, I don't know, you want to call this like a micro suede kind of top with a more traditional faux leather up top on that side of it. And yeah, I don't, just really nice materials. The ear pads are basically made of the same material as the headband. So again, they've kind of got that micro suede on the inside, but kind of a faux leather around the outside as well as on the inner ring. One other thing I wanted to mention about the build quality in this thing that just really stands out as quite nice is the clicks, okay? This might sound like a silly thing, but the way, the positivity, am I gonna get that click on? It's just that's a nice click. It feels just super solid. And again, frankly, for $200, I'm pretty impressed with the build quality. I think the aesthetic of it is a little bit on the old school side for my normal taste, but obviously that's going to be the sort of thing that comes down to you individually. I think this is kind of like a good aesthetic. Would fit in really well in like an office environment or something like that. Just generally like a nice, mature, grown-up aesthetic. Now, in terms of comfort, I'm going to throw this thing on my head in a little bit, but I did want to, while we're here at the table, just kind of point out that the ear pads are a little bit on the small side. So this is definitely an over-ear fitting headphone. It's not an on-ear or anything like that, but it is somewhat of a tight fit here. And you can see also that the depth on the pad is not super tight. And part of that is also exacerbated because the pad is quite soft, to be honest. And because of that, it's just going to end up compressing a fair bit, and there's just not a whole lot of room left over for an ear. Obviously, depending on how large your particular ear is, that may or may not be something that you notice. But on my head, and I guess as I get there, let's throw it on my head. I think this is, you know, a decently comfortable little headphone. It's fairly lightweight, even though it is made out of all those nice premium materials. It doesn't feel heavy. You can see that the cups are small, right? This probably looks a little bit smaller than maybe you're expecting. But I don't know, my ears are, maybe the back of my ear is touching the back of the cup, but I'm not feeling anything abrasive or sharp or anything like that. It's just kind of a cozy fitting headphone that's got a fairly light clamp, enough clamp that it's not going to fall off my head if I do that, as you might be doing while you're listening to music. And yeah, I don't know. One thing that I will point out here as I have it on my head and I'm talking is that even though this is an open back headphone, it's a little bit more occluded than some other open back headphones, which is to say it's not as open as some other headphones, okay? So if you are planning to use this in like an office environment that I was talking about, I think you could get away with listening, not at like super loud volumes, but you could probably get away at listening at very reasonable volumes without annoying people around you. And kind of likewise, there's a little bit of noise outside you. This will do some isolation. I'll give you some isolation from that sound, but it is still an open back, so don't expect it to be as isolating as a closed back. And I guess the last thing I was going to mention here on the build quality, and maybe you've already noticed, is just that it's symmetrical. As far as I can tell, there's, apart from there being an L and an R on there, and then I guess the name Sivga being printed in a particular direction, this thing's pretty much exactly symmetrical. You know, the pivot on the ear cups is exactly the same. So ostensibly you could wear it backward by accident. So just watch out for that. Okay, anything else to talk about here on the build quality and physical form factor? I don't think so. So that'll lead us into talking about the sound signature here on the Sivga Anser. So this is the frequency response that I've measured on my rig. If you want to check this out for yourself, it's on SquigLink. Of course, I've got it linked in the description down below, but let's do a little bit of analysis together. So this dotted dashed line here in the background is roughly what you could call kind of like a warm neutral sound signature. And you can see where the Sivga Anser deviates from that sound signature in, I think, 3 main areas, okay? Area number 1 is going to be the bass. I told you this thing was bassy. Let's talk about that in a little bit. Area number 2 is going to be here in kind of the mid-range region where you do see a dip. There is a bit of a mid-range recession, and just generally this is not a mid-range sound signature. And then also here in the treble, you can just see some unevenness here where maybe it dips a little bit here in this like 6 to 8K region. And then it does get a little bit sparkly up top. And I think that those are all actually pretty informative ways to interpret the sound of this headphone. This is a V-shaped sound signature. It is very much warm and bassy. As far as a V-shaped sound signature goes, there is some treble emphasis that will add kind of like a sparkly character to it. And the mid-range definitely does suffer for this contrasty signature. But nonetheless, you get a lot of bass, and you get it without it necessarily sounding super clouded and muddy like you might get. Even though this bass, frankly, look, this bass shelf is starting at around 400 hertz, which in IEM terms, you kind of want like a bass shelf to start below 200 hertz. So it's starting a little bit early, but just because of how contrasty, how much it's dipping here in the mid-range, you really do get like actually a pretty good sense of separation in the sound. And I guess that's where we will transition into just kind of my personal subjective impressions. It is definitely a warm, bassy, V-shaped sound signature. It's contrasty for sure, but it definitely leans more toward the low end of that sound. And again, like I was just kind of describing, it still does a pretty decent sense of separation between instruments. Imaging is not especially wide, like it is somewhat of a narrow, congested sound stage, if that's a thing that you're prioritizing. But the separation between sounds and the distinction between them, and again, it doesn't give you like this muddy smeariness with all that bass. You still get a decent sense of that separation between sounds. Now, the big sacrifice here is going to be the mid-range, and there's no really two ways about it. The mid-range is not great on this headphone. If you're into listening to vocal content, you like pulling out all that micro contrast and nuance and detail in vocals, the Anser is really not the headphone that's going to do that for you. But if you're looking for a headphone that does a lot of bass, well, it does that. Now, the treble on this thing is generally pretty well done. Like, again, like there's enough of it there to counteract that bass and give it that sense of separation, but it is a little bit uneven. And where I think that contributes to the sound is like there's certain sounds. For example, I was thinking of the tambourine in Mazzy Star's Fade Into You. If you're familiar with that track, Fade Into You, a fantastic track that frankly sounds great on almost everything. But there's a tambourine in that can sound crashy on certain sets, and this is a set that I found that the tambourine on that sounded a little bit crashy. On the plus side, I thought that this set actually did a pretty good job with sibilant tracks. So I was listening to the Parcels live album. Their vocals are recorded a little bit hot. On some sets, it can sound sibilant. On other sets, it can sound fine. Here, it actually sounded fine. So again, I think that's probably playing into the dips and the curves in the treble of this headphone. So it's going to work out for some music better than others. But overall, I think that's just a good way to understand this headphone. It is a not a super balanced sound signature. It is a bit of a... It's an opinionated sound signature. And if you know that this is what you're looking for, I don't think this is a bad execution. But how does it compare to some other headphones in its price range, in its category? Well, let me make some room for them. Which one do I want to start with? I want to start with this one, actually. So this is the Sennheiser HD58X. This is a mass drop cross, well, just drop now, but a drop cross Sennheiser collaboration that retails for, I want to say like $200 now. I think when it first came out, it was 150 bucks. So price range, pretty comparable here to the Anser. What's different about this is that this has been, well, okay, what's notable about this? This is obviously, you know, a riff on the classic Sennheiser HD600, HD6XX series. And I bring this one onto the table, not just because it's priced similarly, but because this is known as being kind of the warmer, bassier version of those Sennheiser headphones. If you've heard those, and you've heard this, and you kind of know how this is like bassier, warmer, richer than those other Sennheisers, then that makes this kind of a good frame of reference for this guy, because the Anser is a lot bassier than the Sennheiser. But it's gonna come across actually maybe a little bit different than you would expect, because if you're just expecting this to be, so again, if you're used to the Sennheiser HD6XX and you hear this as like warmer, a little bit stuffier in the mid-range, and you might expect this to be even more so, it's really not, because there's a lot more contrast here on the Sivga Anser. Again, it gives you more of that V-shaped sound signature, whereas the 58X, while it is a warmer tuned sound, most of that's just coming because the treble is super, super relaxed on this guy and kind of at the upper mid-range. It's still nonetheless like more of a mid-range kind of forward, a little bit on the boxy sounding side, and less so because it has like a lot of bass. There really is not a lot of bass on this set, even though it is known as being the bassier Sennheiser. It's still more of a, it's warm because there's not a lot of treble. And now, because of that, you do still get a nice mid-range sound signature. If you're into the vocal content, I do think that the 58X does a better job of that. If you're into a strong sense of separation and delineation between sounds, I think the Anser does a better job of that. But interestingly, I actually found that this just overall sounds a little bit more open still. Maybe it's just because my ears prefer the more mid-range focus sound signature, but this to me sounds a little bit wider presenting than the Anser. But again, neither of these are really going to be soundstage monsters or anything like that. But yeah, really the big difference is just going to be that while this is warm-ish and bassy-ish, it's kind of a limp bass, to be honest, whereas the bass here on the Anser it's fun and satisfying. Is it super tight and punchy? Punchy, yes. Super tight, not so much. And certainly it's got a lot more impact and physicality behind it than what you're going to get on this. And this is just ends up being the more relaxed, vocal focus sound signature, which for me is actually the reason I prefer the 58X, despite it being a little bit limp and a little bit dead sounding up top. It's just kind of a chill. It's not something I reach for all the time, but if I was picking between these two, I'd probably go for the 58X still. But there's another headphone I wanted to bring in, and that is this. This is the Philips Fidelio X2HR. This is a headphone that I think when it initially came out was probably like $350 or something like that. Now you can get it regularly for $140 or less. And this is also an open back dynamic driver headphone that is known for being a bassy set. I think this is a better match for the Anser. Just in terms of tonal balance, I think both of these are more V-shaped sound signature, whereas the Sennheiser's, again, kind of like more of this boxier mid-range sound. You get a lot more bass emphasis here on the X2 than you do on the Sennheiser, but not quite as much as the bass that you get here on the Anser. So overall, I would say that this ends up sounding kind of like the warmer, thicker, bassier sound, whereas the bass on the X2HR has a nice impact, has a pretty decent physicality and a punch to it. But overall, the sound is just thinner and more top-end focused here on the X2HR. Now, the benefit of that is that you do get a wider, more open soundstage to it. And I think you also do get a little bit more of that nuance in the mid-range versus the Anser. It doesn't sound as closed in and like congested and bass dominated as this guy can. And then in the treble region is kind of where they trade blows, all right? Again, I mentioned this one, it can be a little bit crashy with the tambourines, a little bit, well, actually does well with the sibilants, whereas I think that the X2HR is kind of the opposite. It did the high frequency percussion, like tambourines and hi-hats. It did it better for me than did the Anser, but I actually found this one to be kind of sibilant with that particular Parcels album that I mentioned, their live album. Again, there's just kind of some trade-offs depending on where that treble is going to lie in the particular track you're listening to and how it matches up with the frequency response of the headphone. But that is how they are different, and I think that will do it for my thoughts here on the Sivga Anser. Out of 5 stars, you know what? I think this is a pretty decent little headphone. I'm going to give it a solid 3 stars out of 5. I think I really like the build quality on this thing, the feel of it. This feels like a really well executed consumer-y headphone. It's got a decent amount of bass. Like if you're looking for a headphone to give to somebody that's maybe not into audio and like a mid-range focus sound signature just does not sound like that's going to excite them, something like the Sivga Anser could be it. Or even just yourself, if you're looking for a bassy headphone under $200 that is still open back, but maybe not too open, the Anser's not a bad option. I do think, again, this is the best headphone that I heard at Sivga. Certainly better than their higher end sets. And I guess if you want to check it out, well, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get